Addiction psychedelic research has been systemically erased. Bill Wilson, the co-founder of Alcoholics Anonymous, experimented with LSD in the 1950s, believing that it could play a crucial role in helping alcoholics recover. This presentation will explore the history of Bill Wilson's exploration of psychedelics, the groundbreaking studies on psychedelic-assisted addiction treatment, and the systemic barriers that have prevented these therapies from becoming more widely accepted. Please welcome our final presenter for this block, David Lee.
Oh, hey, how are you? Oops. Hello, my name is David Lee, and I'm grateful to be here. I actually put all this effort, and I had this really cool suit that was like a cross between like the Sopranos hipster combo, and I woke up and I walked into Starbucks dressed like this, and somebody said, "I really like your shirt," which is a cat being chased by a UFO taking a selfie. And I've done enough psychedelic work to know that when the trickster spirits show up, you have to throw all your plans away. And so here we have a UFO cat. And so I've worked in addictions for a really long time. I'm on the advisory board for Psychedelics and Recovery, which is a 12-step group. We meet in the mornings here at 8 o'clock. I co-own 2 addiction outpatient facilities. We do not use plant medicine, not by my choice. I own a behavioral health clinic. I own a big intervention company. I've facilitated probably 5,000 people into treatment, none of them into psychedelic treatment, not by my choice. And so I work in a system that's exceptionally dogmatic and rigid. And so this workshop here, or this presentation, it was originally called Death by Dogma. I submitted it's called Death by Dogma, and they did not like the title, so they kind of tweaked it a little bit. I like Death by Dogma, but its addiction psychedelic research has been systemically erased. There have been treatment centers over the last 140 years that have 5 times higher success rates than anything that exists in the continental United States today. I have worked, I've been a patient. I'll go back a little bit why this is important to me. When I was 19 years old, I went to my first treatment center for cocaine. I was labeled as a substance use disorder client. I didn't use that term back then. I think it was just addict. By my 5th treatment center, after I'd carved my wrist open, they added bipolar. By my 20th treatment center, they added rapid cycling bipolar 2 with co-occurring psychotic features, as well as a substance use disorder. By my 25th, they added with an underlay of childhood trauma. And so I've been bounced around in an exceptionally broken system, but I've worked in 8 treatment centers. I've actually worked with the most expensive treatment center in the country. Right now it's $200,000 a month. And I promise you that there were facilities that existed before today that had a 5 times higher success rate than anything they got going over there for $200,000 a month. And so we're gonna rip through this a little bit. Breakthroughs in addiction research have happened again and again and again, and most people don't know that they exist. I'm a history nerd. I love history. I love mysticism. Mysticism is revealing the things that are hidden. And if you go back in time, you will find these snippets, these moments in time where we had breakthroughs, but they didn't fit, just like the title of my workshop didn't fit. And so I'm going to go back in time to the very beginning. A lot of people don't know that the very first treatment center in the United States, the very first addiction treatment center called the Keeley Institute in the 1890s, it started, actually used plant medicine. And there were, fast forward within a few years, there were hundreds of Keeley Institutes. It was called the Gold Cure. And it was back in the old snake oil kind of thing. So a lot of people that do research, they think it's kind of BS. And a lot of the medical establishment at the time did. There's actually the first Keeley Institute is about an hour outside of Chicago. The building still exists, and you would walk in the door, and you would get injections of this weird thing called the Gold Cure. It didn't have gold, but it likely had things like atropine and henbane, which is witch's brew. It had dissociative or deliriant psychedelics within them. They didn't use the term psychedelic because it hadn't been invented yet. And a lot of people, and fast forward, there's 100 clinics by the early 1900s, 100 clinics, and they had treated approximately 500,000 people. But the medical establishment looked at people like this as snake oil salesmen. It's all BS, it's garbage, because the challenge that we in the psychedelic space face is that traditional recovery has about a 5% success rate, and yet they falsely believe that they have a 100% success rate. that if you fail at it, it's because not the system failed, but because you failed. But if I were to start a psychedelic clinic across the street that had a 50% success rate, they would point at the 50% failures and burn my building to the ground. How do I know that? Because I own an outpatient clinic. I am closeted in my community. I could do a group on any subject involving addiction except for psychedelics because the greater community over there isn't comfortable with it. It doesn't fit. And so the Keeley Institute and places like that were a little bit fringe. They were up against a medical community that didn't believe in what they had to do. So we have to look at outcomes and we have to dig a little bit deeper. And there's this interesting moment in time where the journalist who thought that the Keeley Institute was kind of full of it got a hold of the patient list of all 500 patients at one facility, and they tracked them. And they went out 5 years. And 50% of these alcoholics 5 years later were still sober. 50%. There's no treatment center. There is no addiction program, AA, 12-step smart recovery, that has a 50% success rate out years. And back then, in the 1800s, they did. The birth of the Belladonna Cure. Some of you that are familiar with Bill Wilson's story will know that the Towns Hospital where he got sober actually had the Belladonna Cure. The Belladonna Cure is a really interesting story. There's a guy named Charles Towns, super successful businessman. He was good at everything. He was not a doctor. He was not anything. And this buddy of his is like, they were talking about the opiate epidemic. Because in the 1890s, Bayer Corporation marketed heroin to help the morphine epidemic. And by 1910, 90% of all the arrests in New York were due to heroin. So the morphine heroin epidemic is surging. And he's just sitting around talking to this dude, and this dude goes, I have a cure for addiction. And he goes, what do you mean you have a cure for addiction? He goes, yeah, totally. And he goes, well, why don't you give it to the doctors? And he goes, the doctors don't believe that addiction is curable. He goes, well, that can't be true. So he goes to his own doctor and he asks. And the doctor says, no, addicts can never be cured. They will always use drugs. And so he, being who he is, wants to prove, because he believes the medical establishment is partially responsible for the opiate epidemic. They were the ones, the pharmacists and doctors, that were prescribing it. And he was kind of pissed. And so he wanted to prove him wrong, so he got a hold of this concoction, a combination of belladonna, henbane, some atropine, blue lotus, and they create this thing and they put an ad in the newspaper looking for drug addict. And they get one, and this is actually not a picture of him, but it is symbolic of what happened. And they literally got a doctor, Charles Towns, not a doctor, and a drug addict, and they basically lock him in a room and they give him a bunch of belladonna. I love the early days of addiction psychedelic research, because you could kind of do whatever you wanted. And so they did, and they are administering this to him, and he's going like nutty. He's like, I'm out of here. He destroys the room. The doctor's like, we got to stop. And he's like, nobody's stopping. Charles Towns like, you're not stopping. You're not stopping. He barricades and he locks the doctor, himself, and the addict in the room for 3 days. 3 days later, breakthrough. 3 days later, he has no more cravings. 3 days later, they put morphine in front of him. He doesn't use it. He stays clean for at least 5 years. The beginning of the Belladonna Cure was this concept, this idea that went against the medical idea, which was that maybe, just maybe, we could interrupt addiction. Maybe, just maybe, we could. And he created what eventually becomes the Towns Hospital, and he created this, what they called the cure. We got to be careful. When you go back in time, they use the word cure a lot, and people are like, you cannot cure it. In reality, what they thought was that if you use heroin, you use it every day and can't stop. If you're an alcoholic, you use every day and can't stop. So cure is interrupt the physical. And they found a cure. Charles Towns is a really interesting guy because he unintentionally created the drug war. He was so against the medical establishment for what they did that he enacts legislation in New York, it's the first of its type, to be able to penalize those that indiscriminately give medications such as this to addicts. And it was so beautifully written that it was framed and modeled into the Harrison Act. Those that are not familiar with the Harrison Act was the first domino that, because of how it was written, they didn't arrest the doctors. They arrested me, the drug addicts. And it was the beginning of the drug war. He had punched back against the medical community just like we've seen with the Oxycontin and all that epidemic, and they punch back. And that's what happened. Oops. But Charles Towns changed the world, and he created the Towns Hospital. There's a really cool book called Fantastica. It came out in the 20s. It was the first time they decided to categorize. It was this guy named Louis Lewin. He was this German author, and the reason I include this in here is because set and setting matter. Your belief system, or what you believe, matters. And it was the first time right now to come up with like some coin, some phrase, and they called it Fantastica. But there have been terms over the years. We say psychedelic, we say plant medicine. Here's what's really, really interesting, that over the years, mysticomimetic, psychotomimetic, emulate psychosis. What's really interesting is if I took the same substance in 5 jars, same psychedelic, and I put a different label on each. Entheogen, it helps you to seek the divine within. Mysticomimetic, it helps you to have a mystical experience. Plant medicine, for those that apparently think you're sick and need a medicine. Psychedelic, mind manifesting. We can go on and on. Phenylethyme. And I asked you to take it, and you chose the one that you felt fit. Psychedelics, set and setting matter. What you think it is amplifies. And so the reason I included this here is because it's the first time that we're actually trying to frame, and we can't decide what to call it. Is it an entheogen? Is it an empathogenic? It's like MDMA. Is it a psychedelic? Is it this? Is it that? We can't agree. It's a kaleidoscope, and it changes. Bill Wilson in 1934 goes to the Towns Hospital. He gets the Belladonna Cure. What's really cool about Charles Towns is he released his actual, the formula to change the world. He wanted the world to have it. But there's a little hospital in New York. The building's still there. It was really cool. It was for the elite. It was 4 floors. They had canaries in gilded cages at the top and hydrotherapy and stuff. Bill Wilson, founder of Alcoholics Anonymous, goes there for the 4th time. If you went there, you would get Blue Lotus on the front end, and then you would start to get low dose, psycholytic doses of the Belladonna Cure every hour for 50-hour minimum. 50 every hour. They're going to wake you up like drip, drip, drip. Somewhere in the 4th, he has a white light experience. He feels the presence of God. He has a vision of himself helping thousands of alcoholics, and he believes that he is cured. He believes the obsession has been lifted. He had spent earlier part of the day like talking about religion and surrender and all this stuff to a guy. Fast forward, he has a white light experience. What's really fascinating about Bill Wilson's story in that moment, I've been to detox, and if I went to a detox today and informed the person, hey, I had a white light experience, I saw a vision of God, I'm going to help thousands of alcoholics, and I think I'm cured, they would shuffle me up to the psych ward. But they didn't shuffle him up to the psych ward. They handed him a book, Varieties of Religious Experience, because they honored the sacredness of that moment. And we do not do that in the Western medicine world. How do I know it? Because I've been bounced around in it a lot. In 1935, which is actually considered the year AA was founded, there's another place that gets found, the Lexington Narcotics Farm. Lexington Narcotics Farm is an interesting place because the opiate epidemic that was so serious, they created 2 institutions in the country to be able to figure out what to do with these drug addicts. And this one was not only a prison, but it also had the Addiction Research Center, and it also had a voluntary place where you could go for addiction. Because what had happened unintentionally with Charles Towns, when he enacted that law and then the Harrison Act kicked in, every single medication-assisted treatment that gave opiates to taper down went away because they were now illegal. So what are we going to do with them? We're going to either put them in prison, this kind of... So the ARC, or the Addiction Research Center, is a really fascinating place because what they did right, and the problem with like psychedelic work is that sometimes we get demolished by our worst chapter. For those of you that don't know, the end of the Lexington Narcotics Farm is when MK Ultra invested money on the experiments in the LSD, and it made the Senate hearings, which is the death knell of any kind of research program. But there are beautiful chapters. They believed in multiple paths. They believed in multiple paths of recovery as opposed to a singular path of recovery. You're not allowed to not mention Bicycle Day if you're a presenter at the Psychedelics Conference, I think. Otherwise, like Albert Hoffman shows up at like your journey and at your next one, it haunts you and stuff. So I include it here because it segues into basically the Sandoz laboratories. But what's interesting about LSD If this moment hadn't happened, this conference likely wouldn't happen. And what's really cool about LSD is they didn't look at it as a mystical drug. They looked at it as a psychosis emulator, a psychotomimetic. It emulates psychosis. And so they market it to psychiatrists and doctors in institutions to gain empathy for your patients. Hey, take this. And they would read books. I have a lot of the books. They would read books written by schizophrenics and say, here, read this before you take this LSD. Like, talk about a weird, journey. There's no, fluffy pillows. There's no chanting monks. They're like, welcome to psychosis land. And it's really kind of interesting. And so because of that, though, what had happened, right, is it segued into clinicians. I'm going to tell you right now that in the 1950s, we were further along in research than we are today. Back then, it was legal. Back then, you could use LSD as a clinician and not worry about it. Back then, you could do all kinds of cool stuff. There are thousands of research studies. Thousands. Bicycle Day. The 1950s are the coolest time in the world. 1950s, there's a few things, a few little tidbits. There's a guy named Humphry Osmond, right, who coins the phrase psychedelic. He's sitting around, and they never say this, but I have a hint. He's sitting around, it's like 3 o'clock in the morning with his buddy. And they're experts in schizophrenia, and they're discussing alcoholism. Now, I'm going to tell you right now, if you're hanging around at 3 o'clock in the morning with your buddy discussing alcoholism, you're probably getting drunk. And I'm just going to throw that out there. That I'm pretty sure he was probably getting drunk talking about these old alcoholics. And they said, you know what? We believe that alcoholics get sober because they have this crazy psychotic experience. The DTs, they get stricken sober from a psychotic break. So what if we give them this stuff we've been taking that emulates psychosis? What if we just make them have a schizophrenic episode and see if it just scares the crap out of them? You gotta love the 50s, the land of no rules. Hey, I got an idea. Let's just give a bunch of dudes and or women. In this case, it was a guy and a girl. Hardcore alcoholics. They gave a single dose of LSD. The one got instantly sober and never drank again. The other kept drinking. So they asked around at the local hospitals and they said, give me your worst. Your worst. The ones that can't stay sober. It gives 18 of them show up. Almost 50% of them stay sober. Fast forward, there are thousands that go through. Thousands of people with alcoholism. 30 to 50% stay sober. Canada was at the forefront of alcoholism and psychedelic research. It's such a cool place. I almost did a road trip up there to see, but they've tore down all the buildings. Hospitals, Weyburn. There's a guy who's a friend of his who decides they're going to do the first controlled study using AA and LSD. It's the only time it's ever happened. There was a program up there in Saskatchewan, and it was a 2-month AA immersion program in the 1950s. You go in and you do 2 months of rehab and AA immersion, and you leave. And so he got permission to do a controlled study. We're going to take 2 groups. One, we're just going to give him the 2 months AA immersion, and the second, a single dose of LSD and the 2 months, and we're going to follow them. And the results are in. The non-LSD group, 14% stay sober up to a year. 50% of them drop out of the study and AA. But the LSD group, 90% stay in the study, and 50% are still sober a year later. There is no treatment center in the country right now that has a 50% outcome rate, if we define outcomes as staying sober. 1956, they were ahead of us right now. So Canada was pretty groovy. They had all this cool stuff going on, and Bill Wilson himself starts to catch wind of it. But not yet. Another thing that happens in the 50s is the Minnesota model. In Minnesota, basically there's AA is growing and growing and growing, and the medical community is so grateful to pass the responsibility of alcoholics and addiction to another thing because we're a pain in the ass. We're not like fun clients. We show up drunk, we're mean, we're whiny, we're self-centered, we're like, what about me? Can I get my own room? I mean, we're not like fun, and we're not grateful. You know what I mean? We're just not. We're resistant. We're addicted to avoiding uncomfortable feelings and things and solutions. And so we're kind of a pain in the ass. So AA kind of takes over, and in Minnesota there was an AA farm and a hospital, and they were working together, so they created, it's the first time that they really combined like mystical faith, which is AA, 12-step, and a hospital, right? And they kind of do this. And the Minnesota model is born, and out of 14,000 treatment centers today, the majority of them are a Minnesota model. And it's kind of cool, it helped a lot of people, but you know what it did? The majority of people that work in addiction, the majority of people that work in a Minnesota model are people that got sober in AA. And if you don't know, AA itself isn't, but AA members are staunchly against psychedelics as an aid to their recovery. And they have been for a really long time. And so the problem is what happened was it froze, and it stopped any other research, because there was a one-size-fits-all model, and AA doesn't change. If you can't stay sober, the answer is simple. You just go back to rehab and rework the steps over and over until it works. And if you die, I guess that's your fault. Bill Wilson is intrigued because he's hearing about these cure rates. He says, there is a group in Canada that is helping the people that only 5% of AA is helping. And he begins to experiment with LSD. Interesting thing about Bill Wilson. Bill Wilson's parents dropped him off at 11 and abandoned him. Bill Wilson's girlfriend died at 17. Bill Wilson goes through the Depression. Bill Wilson goes to the war. Bill Wilson, financial ruin. Bill Wilson is trauma 101. Trauma 101, and he begins to explore LSD. And they actually have notes. Betty Eisner, one of the therapists who was there facilitating a session with him, has some notes. And in one of the group LSD sessions, he says, I think I realized that my distrust towards people comes from my relationship with my parents. Trauma 101. He opened the door a crack. He struggled with depression. He was getting sicker, all this stuff. He looked into Jungian therapy, niacin therapy. Bill Wilson is an example of what happens. This is what I believe, and this isn't to criticize AA, but AA is a bell curve. Many people come in, they get better, but then they flatline and they start to get worse because there isn't like AA 2.0. And Bill Wilson himself, crippling depression in the 50s. He sought out a Jungian therapist. He sought out a Jesuit priest. He's trying to get better. He's crying. And the AA community is kind of upset that he's seeking out therapy because it makes it seem that AA doesn't work. AA is exceptionally dogmatic, and that dogmatic rules kind of help people. A lot of us need a rigid container, but at what point do you soften them? Do you tiptoe into psychedelics and be a pariah or a heretic? I don't know. There were many clinics. There was a lot of LSD therapy for alcoholism in the 50s. So many of them that were super cool. If you just follow the rabbit holes, they're so cool. Al Hubbard, he's the guy that actually had the license to be able to distribute LSD. And he was like part mystic, part like snake oil salesman. He's like dragging along this thing of carbogen, which is like carbon dioxide, and you have you inhale it, just because, I don't know, because everything was cool back then. He's the one that set and setting. He's the reason why when you think of that couch with the music, he was the one that believed in the mystical aspects of it. Just a dude. He went out and fraudulently got like a doctor's degree. He paid for it. Why? So that he could get the LSD shipped into. Such interesting times in the 50s. Everything exploded. It was super cool. In the 60s, the hippie culture, which is super groovy. I would at my vibe, I like the trickster archetype. I would have loved the 60s, not the 50s. I love the 50s today. The 60s were just kind of what they were. And unfortunately, because what happens next is in 1970, right, 71, all of a sudden psychedelics are criminalized. And psychedelics have a stigma, and all that research and all that stuff gets erased. You can no longer do it. And it's sad because some of the psychedelic pioneers are begging, just let us at least do it for the dying. At least let us do it to help them transition. And one by one, psychedelic research just disappears, In 1962, a drug addict wandering around in Africa who wants to get high does what I did. I went to Africa and I did an iboga ritual with the witch doctors. It puts me in that weird exotic fringe club. It doesn't make me any more spiritual, it just makes me weirder. And this guy here was just a drug addict, and he took it. He's a heroin addict. and heroin withdrawal, and his addiction to heroin disappeared instantly. And a lot of us talk about ibogaine as an addiction interrupter. People ask what I do for a living. I talk to moms. I talk to thousands of moms. My kid just overdosed. David, you were like a homeless guy, and now you did so well. What did it for you? I can't tell them about ibogaine because it's a career killer. The greatest threat to my profession isn't you or the moms or even the really groovy therapists. It's a traditional community that would burn my outpatient center to the ground if I recommended an illegal or non-sanctioned solution like ibogaine. And so 50% success rate. I have sat across from people on couches and I've said, you're not going to live for another year if you don't stop drinking. And several of them are not here anymore. And part of me wonders, should I have told the mom? Or should I have told them? Should I just roll the dice and see what happens and wear the cat UFO shirt instead of the suit? I don't know. I made a decision to come out a little more of the closet. I made my first little public Facebook post. I got a couple likes. But of those likes, I wonder how many at the end were thinking, God, there he is again, like pushing the edges and causing problems. It's 2025 and we are still catching up to 1955. It is such an honor to be here at this cool, vibey, whatever it is. And, psychedelics are so fascinating to me. It is science and pseudoscience. What you believe matters. And I do, and I mentioned it before. The one thing that I learned in Africa that I brought back with me is I knew in my heart I was sick. And so I was looking for a plant medicine. And sometimes psychedelics are non-specific amplifiers. And I left there feeling like it didn't work because my belief system was already broken. And so I don't take plant medicine anymore. I take mystico-medic. I take entheogens. I seek out the divine. I follow spiritual breadcrumbs. And whatever it is for you is whatever it is for you. So it has been such an honor. I have 16 seconds to go, and I am done. Thank you very much. So, yeah.